Tonight, we shatter a myth carved in stone, a story you think you know, of a monster with serpents for hair and a gaze that meant certain death. But the monster was once a woman. Her story was not lost to time, but silenced by a goddess. For centuries, we've heard the legend of a righteous quest and a deserved punishment. But behind the polished shield of the hero lies a darker truth, a tragedy of devotion, betrayal, and a justice that was anything but just. So before you dismiss this as just another ancient tale, ask yourself, what if the real monster wasn't the one with snakes in her hair? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we look into the eyes of the Gorgon and we will find the reflection of a goddess's terrible regret. Before she was a monster, she was a weaver. Before her hair was a crown of serpents, it was bound in simple linen, catching the dust and light of a sun-drenched workshop. And before her name was a curse, it was whispered with a quiet reverence, not in temples, but in the marketplaces where her tapestries were sold. Her name was Medusa, and her only crime was being good at what she loved. In a small village, perched on the edge of the Aegean Sea, where the scent of salt and olive groves mingled in the air, her loom was the center of the world. The rhythmic clack of her wooden shuttle was the village's heartbeat, a constant song that spoke of creation. She didn't weave stories of gods and titans, of bloody wars or divine betrayals. Instead, she captured the things mortals understood. The silver flash of a fish breaking the water's surface, the exact shade of a plum at perfect ripeness, the tired lines on an old sailor's face. Her threads could mimic the shimmer of heat rising from summer stones in the deep, silent blue of the ocean at midnight. People said she did not weave with wool, but with light and memory itself. Her devotion to Athena was born from this shared language of craft. She did not pray to the goddess with a bowed head and trembling hands, begging for favor or fearing wrath. She prayed with nimble fingers and a steady eye, her every perfect knot a hymn of respect. For Medusa, Athena was not a distant, fearsome queen on Olympus. She was the logic in the loom, the wisdom in choosing a color that could break a heart, the sharp, clear-headed focus required to turn chaos into beauty. Every tapestry she finished was an offering, a quiet conversation with the goddess she revered as the ultimate artist. She saw Athena in the straightness of a perfectly warped loom and the unyielding strength of a well-spun thread. The villagers saw a gifted girl, but the gods, they saw something else. They saw a mortal whose hands moved with a grace that rivaled their own, a devotion so pure it shone like a beacon. And in a world where gods grew bored and jealous, a light that bright is rarely allowed to shine for long. It draws attention, not just from the heavens, but from the restless, hungry depths of the sea. Word of her talent traveled, carried on the salt-laced winds, and in the holds of merchant ships. A tapestry she wove of a single wave, so real you could almost feel the spray, was bought by a trader and found its way to Athens. There, in the bustling heart of the city, it was hung in a place of honor, and people who had never seen the sea stood before it in silence. Soon, it was not just traders who sought her out, but scholars and priests, men who understood that what Medusa did was more than craft. It was a form of prayer. One sweltering afternoon in the month of Hecatombeon, a procession arrived in her small village. At its head was a high priest from the Parthenon itself, his white robes a stark contrast to the dusty, sun-baked earth. He did not ask for a demonstration. He simply stood before her loom, where she was weaving a scene of olive trees under a full moon, and he watched. He saw the way she chose her threads not by sight, but by touch. He saw the focus in her eyes, a stillness that seemed to belong to another world. This, he realized, was not work. This was devotion. The offer was made that evening, as the sun bled orange and purple into the sea. Medusa was invited to serve as a priestess in the temple of Athena on the Acropolis. It was a summons, a dream she had never dared to speak aloud. to live within the sacred walls, to breathe the same air as the goddess, to spend her days in service and contemplation, surrounded by the greatest works of art and wisdom the world had ever known. It was the highest honor a mortal woman could receive. But the price was leaving everything behind. Her small workshop, the sound of the gulls, the faces of the people who had watched her grow. To become a priestess was to step out of the normal stream of life, to forsake marriage, family, and the simple earthly joys she so perfectly captured in her threads. Her past would become a memory, her future a sacred vow. There was no hesitation. With tears in her eyes, she accepted. Her village celebrated her departure as a triumph, but it felt like a funeral too. The death of a simple life, and the birth of something far grander and far more dangerous. As she sailed toward the distant silhouette of Athens, a city of gleaming marble and ambition, she did not know that she was a thread being woven into a much larger, darker tapestry, one designed not by her hands, but by the cold, calculating will of the gods. Life in the Parthenon was a waking dream. The cool marble floors seemed to hum with centuries of prayer, and the air was thick with the scent of burning olive oil and sacred incense. Medusa's days fell into a gentle, ordered rhythm. She swept the colonnades at dawn, polished the golden offerings until they shone like captured suns, and spent long, peaceful afternoons in the temple's weaving room, creating tapestries meant only for the goddess's eyes. Here, surrounded by silent, devoted sisters, she felt a sense of belonging she had never known. The world outside, with its noise and its striving, faded into a distant memory. This was her sanctuary, a place of wisdom, order, and quiet creation, the very heart of Athena's domain. She had never been happier, but a sanctuary is only safe until something outside decides to look in. It began not as a sound or a sight, but as a feeling, a sudden chill in the warm afternoon air, a faint, persistent scent of salt and brine that did not belong so high on the sun-baked hill of the Acropolis. At first, Medusa dismissed it, but the feeling grew. She would be tending the eternal flame and feel a gaze on the back of her neck, so cold and heavy it was like the pressure of the deep ocean. She would turn, but there was never anyone there. Only the impassive marble statues and the vast empty space of the temple. The other priestesses seemed not to notice, lost in their own serene devotion. The disturbance was for her alone. Then she began to see him in the polished surfaces, not a clear image, but a suggestion. A dark bearded face in the reflection of a bronze shield, a powerful form in the shimmer of a water basin. It was Poseidon, god of the sea, lord of earthquakes, and Athena's oldest rival. He did not come with the roar of a tidal wave, but with the silent, creeping dread of a rising tide. His attention was not a compliment. It was an intrusion, a violation of the temple's sacred stillness. It felt like the sea laying claim to the shore, a relentless, powerful force that sought to possess, not to admire. The bright peace of Medusa's service began to fray at the edges, overshadowed by a presence that felt ancient, possessive, and utterly unwelcome. A dark cloud had gathered over her perfect sky, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was a storm she could not escape. The feeling of being watched sharpened into a voice. It was not a sound that traveled to her ears, but one that bloomed directly in her mind, a low murmur like the distant tide. Her name, Medusa, spoken on a current of air that smelled of drowned sailors and ancient depths. He was no longer content to be a reflection. Gifts began to appear. She would return to her small, simple chamber to find them placed on her sleeping mat. A perfect pearl, black as a starless night, glistening as if still wet from the ocean floor. A branch of coral, impossibly intricate, its edges sharp enough to draw blood. A nautilus shell, its inner chambers swirling in a perfect, divine spiral. These were not offerings, they were claims. They were the jewels of a kingdom she wanted no part of, from a king she did not serve. Her peace was shattered. The gentle rhythm of her days was broken by a constant humming dread. Her hands, once so steady at the loom, began to tremble. The other priestesses noticed the change. They saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way she would flinch at sudden shadows. They whispered among themselves, believing she was being tested by the goddess, that this was a trial of faith. But Medusa knew this was not a test from Athena. This was an invasion. Finally, one evening when the fear became a weight too heavy to carry alone, she sought out the high priestess, Iphianassa. She found her lighting the sacred lamps, her face in the flickering glow a mask of tired wisdom. With a trembling voice, Medusa confessed everything: the gaze, the voice, the gifts. She expected comfort, perhaps a ritual of protection. What she received was fear. Iphianassa's eyes, usually so serene, widened for a moment before a familiar weariness settled back into them. The priestess took Medusa's hands, her own feeling as cold as the stone floor. "You must be a rock in the surf, child," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Unmoving, silent. You do not fight the sea, you endure it." Medusa stared, confused. But this was Poseidon, a god. Surely Athena would— "Pray to Athena for wisdom," Iphianassa interrupted, as if hearing her thoughts. "But do not ask her for war. To anger the sea god is to invite an earthquake that would shatter this sacred hill. He would bring his wrath down not just on you, but on this temple, on all of us." The advice was not a comfort, it was a cage. Medusa left the chamber, feeling the marble beneath her feet colder than ever before, utterly and completely alone. Abandoned by mortal counsel, Medusa turned to the divine. That night, long after the other priestesses had retired to their chambers, she knelt before the great chryselephantine statue of Athena that dominated the temple's heart. The air was still and heavy. In the flickering lamplight, the goddess of wisdom, carved from ivory and gold, seemed impossibly vast and remote. Medusa did not ask for wisdom now, she begged for protection. Her prayer was a frantic, silent torrent of words poured out at the statue's unfeeling feet. She spoke of her fear, of the crushing weight of Poseidon's gaze, of the violation of the sacred space she had sworn to uphold. She reminded the goddess of her years of faithful service, of the tapestries woven in her honor, of the life she had given up to be here. She was Athena's servant, her devotee, her child in all but blood. Surely her goddess would not abandon her to the predatory whims of her rival. As her prayer reached its desperate peak, the air in the temple grew cold. The flames of the lamps dipped low, their light turning a silvery, sterile white. A presence filled the space, ancient and immense, a power that made the very marble seem to tremble. Athena was there. She did not appear in a flash of lightning, but coalesced from shadow and light, a figure of terrible, disciplined beauty. Her eyes, the color of gray olives, were not warm. They were sharp, analytical, assessing the situation like a general studying a battlefield. She looked down at Medusa, not at a frightened young woman, but at a tactical problem. Medusa fell silent, her heart a frantic bird in her chest, waiting for words of comfort. But the goddess's voice, when it came, was as cold and clear as winter air. "You are a priestess in my temple. His actions are an insult to me." Medusa's hope flickered. It was not about her. It was about pride. "He will not dare to defile this place further," Athena continued, her voice devoid of any emotion. "But you must not give him a reason. Do not provoke him. A god's pride is more dangerous than his lust." The words struck Medusa with the force of a physical blow. It was not a promise of protection. It was a warning. a command to endure, to be silent, to make herself small, so as not to inconvenience the great and powerful. She was a piece on a board, a potential liability in a game played between immortals. Just as quickly as she had appeared, Athena was gone. The air warmed, the lamps returned to their golden glow, but the chill remained deep within Medusa's soul. She was no longer just afraid of Poseidon. She was afraid for herself, a mortal girl caught in a cold war between gods, who saw her not as a person, but as a prize, a problem, or a pawn. Athena's counsel was a cage of ice around Medusa's heart. She tried to obey. She made herself smaller, quieter, a shadow within the shadows of the great temple. She kept her eyes fixed on her loom or on the marble floors, never letting them stray to a reflective surface. She avoided the open courtyards and stayed within the temple's inner sanctums, hoping its sacredness was a shield. She prayed, but her prayers were no longer filled with reverence, only a low, constant hum of dread. She did not provoke, she did not resist. She tried to become nothing, a ghost in her own life, hoping the tide of Poseidon's attention would recede. But a god's pride once pricked does not heal. It festers. He saw her avoidance not as fear, but as defiance. He saw Athena's cold warning not as a command, but as a challenge. And one afternoon, as the sun cast long golden spears of light through the high windows of the Parthenon, the tide came in. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of salt. The light from the braziers flickered wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. He was there, not as a whisper or a reflection, but in his full, terrifying form. Poseidon stood before her, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, his presence an earthquake that shook the very foundations of her soul. He did not speak of gifts or beauty. His voice was the roar of a wave crashing against stone, filled with rage at being denied. He was a force of nature, an elemental power, and she was just a girl of thread and bone. He lunged. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of terror. It was not a struggle, it was an obliteration. Her quiet, ordered world, the sanctuary she had given her life to, was shattered. The sacred floor where she had knelt in prayer was cold and unyielding against her back. The tapestries she had woven depicting Athena's triumphs seemed to watch in silent woven horror. This was not just an attack on her, it was a desecration. It was Poseidon planting his trident in the heart of his rival's most holy place, using Medusa's body to declare his victory. When it was over, he was gone, leaving behind only the scent of brine and a profound, echoing silence. Medusa lay on the cold marble, a broken vessel in a defiled temple. The golden light of the afternoon still streamed through the windows, but for her all light had gone out. Silence has a weight. In the moments after, it was a heavy blanket that smothered all thought, all feeling. Medusa did not move. The golden light of the afternoon slowly faded to the bruised purple of dusk, and still she lay on the floor, a forgotten offering. Eventually, the shuffling feet of other priestesses found her. There were gasps, hushed whispers, eyes that looked at her with a new kind of terror. They did not see a sister who was hurting. They saw contamination, a walking, breathing sacrilege that now polluted their sacred space. They helped her to her feet, their touch clinical and cold, and led her away. She did not resist. Others came with buckets of water and cloths, scrubbing the marble not to cleanse her memory, but to erase the stain of Poseidon's presence. The temple had to be purified. Medusa waited. Through the long, hollow hours of the night, she waited for a sign, for the roar of thunder that would announce Zeus's judgment, for the searing light of Athena descending in a fury of polished steel and righteous anger. An unspeakable crime had been committed in the heart of a goddess's sanctuary. An oath had been broken. A life had been shattered. Justice, she believed, was the natural order of the heavens. It had to come. But the night remained quiet. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent. Dawn broke, pale and gray, with no answer. High on Mount Olympus, there was no talk of justice for a mortal. There were only murmurs of politics. Zeus, the king of gods, would not raise his hand against his own brother for the sake of a priestess. To do so would be to admit a weakness in their divine family, to invite chaos and challenge. The other gods saw the event not as a tragedy, but as a strategic move in the endless game of power between the sea and the sky. The conversation was about the insult to Athena's authority, the audacity of Poseidon's trespass. Medusa's name was barely a footnote. The crime was not the violation of a woman, but the defilement of property. Her suffering was irrelevant. The true victim, in the eyes of the gods, was Athena's pride. This silence was the verdict. It was a cold, cosmic declaration that her pain did not matter. She was a casualty, a message, a wound inflicted upon one god by another. The silence from Olympus was not an absence of sound. It was an answer, and the answer was that she was nothing. The silence from Olympus finally broke, not with the thunder of justice, but with the chilling crackle of a goddess's rage. Athena came. She did not coalesce from shadow this time. She appeared in a flash of bronze light that made the marble walls ring, her spear in hand, her shield on her arm, and her eyes blazing with a fury that had nowhere else to go. She could not strike Zeus. She could not challenge Poseidon. The intricate politics of the gods had bound her hands, leaving her with a defiled temple and a burning, impotent shame. So she turned her wrath upon the only one she could. The mortal stain at the center of her humiliation, she stood over Medusa, not as a protector, but as a judge, jury, and executioner. Medusa looked up, and for a fleeting, foolish moment, she thought the goddess had come to save her. But there was no compassion in Athena's face, only a cold, terrifying fire. "You have brought this upon my house." Athena's voice was not a whisper, but a sharp, cutting edge. "You allowed a stain to foul this sacred ground. You became a monument to my rival's arrogance." Medusa tried to speak, to explain that she had no choice, but her voice was a dry rasp. "He will not be punished," Athena continued, her voice dripping with venomous clarity. "But this will not happen again. You will not be a temptation. You will not be a vessel for any man's desire. I will give you a protection no one can breach." Athena raised her hand, and a power, ancient and remorseless, surged from her. It was not a healing touch. It was an unmaking. Medusa screamed as a searing agony shot through her scalp. Her long, beautiful hair, once her quiet pride, began to writhe and twist, thickening, hardening, each strand becoming a living, hissing serpent. Her skin grew pale and cold, her features sharpening into a mask of terror, and her eyes. A burning, terrible power flooded her gaze, a curse that felt like a poison. She could feel it, the lethal energy waiting behind her lids. "Now, no man will ever look upon you with desire again," Athena declared, her voice a final, merciless verdict. "They will look upon you and see only their end. You are protected." With that, the goddess vanished, leaving behind the acrid smell of ozone and a silence more profound than before. The curse was born, not from malice, but from a goddess's wounded pride. It was not a punishment for Medusa's actions, but for her very existence. It was a tragic, twisted gift, a cage of ultimate protection. Medusa did not wake up slowly. Consciousness crashed back into her like a wave, cold and brutal. For a moment, there was only a dull, throbbing ache and a strange, heavy weight on her head. Then she heard it, a sound she had never heard before, a dry, whispering rustle, a chorus of faint hisses that seemed to come from all around her, and yet, from inside her own head. She raised a trembling hand to her hair, expecting the familiar soft strands. Instead, her fingers brushed against something cool, scaled, and alive. It recoiled from her touch with a sharp hiss. She snatched her hand back as if burned, a choked sob catching in her throat. This wasn't real. It was a nightmare, a fever dream born of grief and trauma. But the weight remained, and the hissing grew louder, more agitated. Stumbling to her feet, she lurched through the empty corridors of the temple, her mind a screaming void. She had to see. She needed proof that this was a lie. She found a polished bronze urn used for water offerings, its surface just reflective enough. With a deep, shuddering breath, she forced herself to look. The face that stared back was hers, but it was a twisted parody, pale as bone, eyes wide with a terror that was not a reflection but a living thing. And her hair, it was a writhing crown of vipers, their tongues flicking, their bodies coiling and uncoiling in a hideous, constant motion. A scream finally tore from her lungs, raw and broken. As she cried out, a small sparrow that had made its nest in the high rafters of the temple took flight, startled by the sound. It swooped down, passing in front of her. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, met its tiny, bead-like gaze for a fraction of a second. The bird's wings froze mid-flap. Its chirping was cut short. It dropped from the air like a stone, hitting the marble floor with a sharp, unnatural clink. Medusa stared at the perfectly still, feathered statue. The true horror of Athena's protection washed over her. It wasn't just her hair. It was her eyes. Her gaze was death. She was a monster, a walking plague. A single look could unmake life. This temple, her sanctuary, was no longer a home. It was a cage where she was the danger. She had to flee. Under the cold, uncaring light of the moon, she ran from the Acropolis, a creature of nightmare fleeing the ruins of a dream. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her grief was a physical weight, but her terror was greater. Terror of what she had become and what she might do. She ran until the manicured stones of Athens gave way to dirt, and the dirt gave way to the sharp, salty air of the sea. She stole a small fishing boat under the cover of darkness, not with skill, but with a desperate, clumsy haste. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to go away. Away from people, from life, from anything her eyes could break. The sea, vast and empty, was her only escape. For days she drifted, letting the winds and currents carry her where they would, her gaze fixed on the wooden floor of the boat, too terrified to look up at the gulls that cried overhead. She landed on an island that felt like the end of the world, Sarpedon. It was a place of jagged black rock and windswept shores, where no trees grew and the only sound was the crash of waves against stone. It was a perfect prison. Here, she could hurt no one. The loneliness was a physical thing, a constant ache in her chest. She learned the terrible rules of her new existence. A crab scuttling across the rocks became a perfect, still sculpture. A wild goat that wandered too close froze mid-bleat, its surprised expression immortalized in stone. She learned to walk with her eyes on the ground, to live in a world of blurs and shadows, her lethal gaze a constant burden. She was utterly, eternally alone. And then they came. She heard them first, two shrieks that were not of this world, sharp and furious, cutting through the endless moan of the wind. They descended from the sky on vast leathery wings, their forms monstrous and powerful. They were Stheno and Uriel, the Gorgons, her sisters. They were not cursed mortals. They were ancient, primal beings, of rage and terror, with bronze claws and tusks like boars, and they were not afraid of her. They landed before her, their own serpent hair writhing in a chaotic symphony with hers. They looked directly at her, their own gazes terrible but not petrifying. For the first time since her transformation, she met another's eyes and did not destroy them. They did not offer words of comfort. They did not weep for her. They simply stood with her, two pillars of ancient fury recognizing a new, wounded reflection of themselves. In their monstrous company, Medusa found a strange and terrible solace. They were a family of outcasts, a trinity of terror on a forgotten rock. She was no longer alone in her monstrosity, and on the desolate isle of Sarpedon that was enough. Years passed in a slow, grinding rhythm of tides and wind. On Sarpedon, time was not measured in seasons, for nothing grew or died. It was measured only in silence. Medusa learned to live within this silence, a creature of shadow and stone, her only company the primal rage of her immortal sisters. But the world of men has a long memory and a thirst for stories. Whispers of a monster on a forgotten island, a gorgon whose gaze could turn flesh to rock, began to travel on the tongues of sailors and merchants. The story twisted in the telling, as stories do. The tale of a cursed priestess was lost, replaced by the legend of a beast guarding a treasure. And so they began to come. The first was a pirate, a man whose laughter was as loud as his boasts. He landed on their shore with a dozen men, swords drawn, seeking glory. Stheno and Euryale met them on the beach in a storm of claws and shrieks, but the captain, arrogant and unafraid, pushed past them, climbing the dark rocks toward Medusa's cave. She tried to warn him. A low hiss escaped her lips, a sound meant to drive him away. He only grinned, raising his blade. "There you are, beast." He took a step forward, and in a desperate act of self-preservation, she lifted her head. Their eyes met. The grin froze on his face. The life drained from his eyes, his skin hardening into a rough, gray texture. He became a perfect statue of defiance, his sword arm forever raised to strike. He was the first piece in her collection. After him came others, a young prince seeking to prove his valor, a grizzled old warrior hoping for one last legendary kill, a crew of treasure hunters convinced she was guarding a trove of gold. They came with nets, with shields, with polished mirrors they thought would trick her. They were all wrong. Each time, her sisters would fight, and each time, Medusa would be forced to defend her life with the very curse that had ruined it. The island, once barren, began to fill with statues. A grim garden of stone men, each one a monument to his own foolish pride. They stood in poses of attack, of shock, of terror. Medusa did not see them as trophies. She saw them as a sad, silent chorus, a testament to the men who sailed to the end of the world not to save someone, but to destroy something they did not understand. High on Olympus, where time flowed like honey and mortal lives were but flickers in the long, slow blink of an immortal eye, Athena watched. She did not need a scrying pool or a whispered prayer to see the world. It unfolded for her, a living tapestry she could observe at will. Her gaze often fell on Athens, on the battlefields where strategies she whispered in generals' ears won wars, or in the workshops where artisans crafted wonders in her name. But more and more her attention was drawn to a dark speck in a wine-dark sea, Sarpedon. From her throne she saw the island not as mortals did, but with the cold clarity of a goddess. She saw the waves crash against shores that knew no spring. She saw the two immortal Gorgons, creatures of pure chaos, circling the island like vultures. And she saw Medusa. She saw the girl she had once known as a weaver of dreams, now living a nightmare. She watched as Medusa walked with her gaze forever downward, a prisoner of her own vision. She saw the loneliness that clung to her like a shroud, a solitude so profound it was a tangible force. And she saw the garden. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, understood consequences better than any other. She saw the stone figures not as monsters defeated, but as a grim equation. The pride of men on one side, her curse on the other, and the result was this gallery of frozen screams. She had intended to protect Medusa, to make her untouchable, to shield her from the desires of gods and men. A logical, if ruthless, solution. But logic did not account for this. This was not a shield. It was a cage. A punishment far crueler than any crime. Guilt was a foreign emotion to Athena. It was messy, illogical, a human failing. But as she watched the girl she had cursed move like a ghost among the statues of the men she had killed, a cold, heavy feeling began to settle in her divine heart. It was the burden of wisdom, the terrible understanding that even a perfect strategy could lead to an imperfect, tragic end. She had not saved her priestess. She had merely created a more elegant monster and a prison from which there was no escape. Far from the haunted shores of Sarpedon, in the sun-drenched kingdom of Seriphos, a different kind of monster reigned. King Polydectes was a man whose cruelty was wrapped in a king's smile, his desires a poison that soured everything he touched. And he desired Danae, a woman of noble birth who had washed ashore on his island years ago, clutching her infant son. That son, Perseus, was now a young man, strong and fiercely protective of his mother. He was the only thing that stood between the king and his prize. Polydectes was clever. He knew he could not simply cast the boy aside without turning the people against him. So he wove a trap, not of steel, but of pride. He announced a grand banquet, declaring his intention to seek the hand of a princess from a neighboring kingdom. To celebrate this, he commanded every nobleman in Seriphos to present him with a gift, a fine horse to add to the royal stables. The hall was filled with lords and warriors, each promising steeds of great value. Perseus stood among them, his tunic simple, his pockets empty. He had no land, no gold, and certainly no horse to give. He was a fisherman's son by raising, not a prince. Polydectes called upon him, his voice dripping with false kindness. And you, Perseus, the boy I have so generously sheltered, what gift will you bring to honor your king's betrothal? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the young man. Humiliation burned on Perseus's cheeks. He was being mocked, made to look like a beggar. In a surge of youthful pride and frustration, he spoke without thinking, his voice ringing through the hall. I have no horse to give you, my king, but I would gladly bring you a gift far greater. Name any other prize, and I shall fetch it. I would even bring you the head of the Gorgon, Medusa. A gasp went through the crowd. The name was a dark whisper, a legend meant to frighten children. But Polydectes' eyes lit up with a venomous victory. The boy had sprung the trap himself. The king rose from his throne, a triumphant smile on his lips. "A noble vow," he declared, his voice booming so all could hear. "We shall hold you to it. Forget the horses, young Perseus. Your gift to me will be the head of Medusa. Do not return to this island till you have it." Perseus felt the blood drain from his face. The weight of his own foolish words settled upon him like a shroud. He had just publicly vowed to complete a quest from which no man had ever returned. He had just signed his own death warrant, and as he looked at the king's triumphant face, he knew that was exactly the point. Perseus left the king's hall with the cheers of foolish men ringing in his ears, and the cold silence of his own doom settled in his heart. He walked to the shore, the place where his life on Seriphos had begun, and prepared for it to end. The quest was impossible. Medusa was a legend, a creature beyond the reach of mortals, hidden on an island no map could find. He had no ship, no weapon, no knowledge. He had only a boastful promise, and it was going to cost him his life. He sat on the sand as dusk fell, watching the waves, when a sudden warmth spread through the air. A young man stood beside him, a traveler with a sly grin and sandals that seemed to twitch with an impatient energy, little feathers sprouting from their heels. It was Hermes, the messenger, the trickster, the guide to impossible places. "A heavy vow for a boy with empty pockets," the god said, his voice like rustling leaves. King Polydectes sends you to your death, but a son of Zeus should not die so foolishly. Hermes unlaced his sandals and offered them to Perseus. These will carry you where maps cannot, but they will not save you from her gaze. Just as Hermes vanished, the air grew still and heavy, charged with an ancient authority. A woman stood before him, tall and severe, her eyes the color of a storm-gray sky. In her hand she carried a round shield of polished bronze, so bright it reflected the stars beginning to appear above them. It was Athena. She did not smile. Her face was a mask of cold purpose. She had watched the vow from Olympus, had seen the pawn placed on the board. This boy was not a hero. He was a solution, an instrument to correct a mistake she could never admit to making. The sandals will take you to her, Athena said, her voice devoid of warmth. But your eyes will betray you. Even a hero's courage is no match for her curse. She held out the shield. This will be your eyes. Do not look upon the Gorgon. Look only at her reflection in the bronze. A monster is not defeated with courage, boy. It is defeated with strategy. Perseus took the shield. It was heavy, not just with weight, but with a profound and terrible sadness he could not understand. He looked at his own face mirrored in its surface, a frightened boy playing a hero's part. He did not know that the shield he held was a final, tragic gift from a goddess to the priestess she had abandoned. An act of profound, chilling irony. With winged feet to carry him and a goddess's wisdom to guide his eyes, Perseus was no longer just a boy. He was a weapon, aimed at the heart of an ancient tragedy. The winged sandals carried him across the sea, a blur of motion between the endless blue below and the vast, empty sky above. The world of men became a distant memory, replaced by the rush of wind and the hum of divine magic at his heels. He flew for what felt like days, past islands green with life, until the air grew colder and the sea turned a deeper, more mournful shade of gray. Then he saw it, a jagged rock thrust from the ocean like a broken tooth, an island of black stone and twisted leafless trees, Sarpedon. As Perseus descended, the silence was the first thing he noticed. It was a dead quiet, not peaceful but predatory, as if the very air was holding its breath. He landed softly on a beach of black pebbles, the polished shield held tight against his chest. The place was a graveyard. Dotted along the desolate landscape were statues, not carved by any artist, but frozen in poses of agony and shock. A warrior with his sword raised, a sailor shielding his eyes, a prince reaching out in terror, the grim garden Athena had watched with guilt. He had not taken 10 steps before a shriek ripped through the air, a sound of pure rage that scraped the soul. From the gray sky, 2 figures descended. They were not human. They had the bodies of women, but were twisted into nightmares with great leathery wings, hands of gleaming bronze, and tusks that curled from their mouths like a boar's. They were Steno and Euryale, the immortal Gorgons, the guardians of their tormented sister. They saw the intruder, the flash of bronze, the sandals of a god, and knew he was not another lost sailor. He was a hunter, a raw, protective fury ignited in their eyes. They did not attack to kill for sport. They attacked to defend. They were a storm of claws and teeth, diving at Perseus with a speed that defied nature. He was no match for them. His sword was useless against their immortal hides. All he could do was run. The winged sandals flared to life, lifting him from the ground as bronze claws slashed the air where he had been. A frantic chase began. He darted and weaved through the island's jagged cliffs and stone spires, the 2 furies always just behind him, their shrieks echoing off the rocks. They were relentless, a whirlwind of protective rage. He was not a warrior here. He was prey. Spotting a dark fissure, At the base of a cliff, a cave mouth choked with shadow, he dove for it without a second thought. He tumbled into the darkness, scraping his arms on the rough stone, the shrieks of the gorgons fading as he scrambled deeper into the earth. He was safe. For a moment, he leaned against the damp wall, his heart pounding, listening to the furious cries outside, and then he heard a different sound coming from the depths of the cave. Not a shriek of rage, but a soft, mournful hissing. He moved deeper into the cave, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence between the hisses. The darkness was absolute, but he did not need light. He needed only the shield. Holding it before him like a bronze eye, he advanced toward the sound, his own terrified face staring back at him from the polished surface. The cave opened into a larger chamber, and there, in the dim light filtering from cracks in the ceiling, he saw her reflection. She was not the raging monster he had imagined. A woman sat on a crude stone throne, her form slender and draped in the tattered remains of a priestess's robe. Her face, in the mirror, was a mask of eternal sorrow. And her hair was a writhing, living crown of green and black serpents, their tongues flicking, their bodies coiling and uncoiling in a constant whispery motion. Medusa heard him enter. Another one. Another hero come to spill her blood and carry her head as a prize. She had long ago stopped feeling fear or even anger. There was only a bone-deep weariness. She rose from her throne, the snakes on her head sensing the intruder, their hissing growing louder, more agitated. She did not look at him. She had learned long ago to keep her gaze fixed on the ground. She would not add another statue to her grim collection, unless she had no choice. But then she saw what he carried. It was not a sword held high, or a spear aimed at her heart. It was a shield, held with its face toward her, and it shone with a light that did not belong in this dark, forgotten place. It was a perfect mirror. Curiosity, an emotion she had not felt in years, stirred within her. She lifted her head, not to look at the man, but at the reflection he offered. And for the first time since she had fled the Parthenon in shame and terror, Medusa saw herself. The face was a nightmare. The snakes were a horror. But it was the shield itself that stole her breath. She knew that craftsmanship, the subtle curve, the way light bent around its edges, the owl motif barely visible at its rim. It was Athena's. It was the work of the goddess she had once loved with all her heart. And in that single, horrifying moment, everything became clear. The curse had not been a fit of rage. It had been a strategy. The shield was not just a tool for this boy. It was the final message. It was Athena, showing Medusa what she had made her and why. A weapon, a prison, a solution to a problem she herself had refused to solve. This boy was not the enemy. He was just the final, calculated move in a divine game. A tear, the first in an age, traced a path down her cheek. The truth, colder and sharper than any blade, had finally found her. Perseus watched the single tear carve a path through the grime on her reflected cheek, and his hand trembled. This was not the final stand of a monster. This was the silent grief of a woman who had just understood her own tragedy. In the mirror of the shield, he saw her eyes no longer burning with a curse, but clouded with a terrible acceptance. She knew why he was here. She knew who had sent him, and she did not intend to fight. She lowered her head slightly, a gesture that was not submission, but a kind of final weary consent. The priestess in her, the girl who had once woven tributes to a goddess of wisdom, understood the cold and perfect logic of the sacrifice. Her part in the story was over. Perseus felt a sickness rise in his throat. He was no hero slaying a beast. He was an executioner, sent to complete a sentence passed down long ago. But the thought of his mother, her life held hostage by the whims of King Polydectes, steeled his resolve. He could not falter. He was an instrument of fate, and his feelings did not matter. Turning his face away, trusting only the bronze reflection, he drew the sharp sickle sword Hermes had given him. He moved forward, his steps now silent, his purpose grim. He saw her reflection close its eyes. The snakes on her head seemed to sense the end, their hissing softening into a low, mournful hum. The sword sang a single sharp note as it swung through the chilled air. There was no struggle, no sound of battle, only the clean finality of the strike. The hissing stopped. An awful, complete silence filled the cave, a quiet so profound it felt louder than any scream. The body of the last mortal Gorgon crumpled to the stone floor. But death, in the world of gods, is rarely an ending. It is merely a door. As Perseus, his eyes still averted, carefully wrapped the severed head in a square of cloth, the cave began to tremble. From the stump of Medusa's neck, blood did not just flow, it pulsed. It erupted, not with the color of mortal life, but with a shimmering divine light. A power, caged for so long in that cursed form, was now free. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and wild freedom, as if a storm had been born in the heart of the earth. He held not a trophy, but a tragedy, and its power was only just beginning to awaken. The shimmering blood did not pool on the floor. It gathered itself, coalescing into two distinct forms of pulsing, vibrant energy. The cave, once a tomb of sorrow, became a womb of creation. From one pool of divine ichor a shape began to rise, not of flesh, but of pure, untamed freedom. It was the form of a horse, sculpted from sea foam and starlight, its coat the brilliant white of a breaking wave. Then, from its powerful shoulders, two great wings unfurled, each feather a sliver of captured dawn. This was Pegasus, the child of the sea god's power and the weaver's gentle soul, a creature of impossible beauty born from an act of terrible violence. He shook his magnificent head, his mane flowing like mist, and took a breath that was not of air, but of pure spirit. He was the freedom Medusa had never known, the soaring dream trapped within the priestess's heart, now given flight. He paid no mind to Perseus or the body from which he sprang. With a single powerful beat of his wings, he launched himself from the cave floor, a living star ascending into the darkness, breaking through the fissure in the rock and escaping into the gray waiting sky. The second pool of blood did not create beauty, it forged strength. The light condensed, hardening not into flesh, but into something that resembled golden, living bronze. It rose into the shape of a man, tall and powerful, his features noble and fierce. In his hand he did not hold a weapon, he was born with it. A sword of pure unblemished gold, its edge sharp enough to cut shadows, its light a testament to a power that had refused to be extinguished. This was Chrysaor, the warrior with the golden sword. He was the strength Medusa had been denied, the righteous fury she had been forced to swallow, the protector she never had. He was her pain, her resilience, her silent defiance, now given a voice of steel. He stood for only a moment, his gaze sweeping over the cave, not with curiosity, but with an innate, kingly authority. He, too, ignored Perseus, the small mortal witness to his birth. With a stride that made the very stone beneath his feet tremble, he walked from the cave, not to escape, but to claim his place in a world that had, until now, only known his mother as a monster. The cave was silent again. The body on the floor was now just a shell. Perseus stood alone, the wrapped head in his hand feeling heavier than a mountain. He had come to kill a monster, but instead, he had released a dream and a warrior. He had not ended a story. He had merely turned the page, unleashing Medusa's true, untamable spirit upon the world. Perseus fled the island as if the ghosts of what he had unleashed were at his heels. With the winged sandals of Hermes carrying him high above the gray, uncaring sea, he clutched the wrapped bundle to his side. The cloth could not contain the cold that emanated from it. a chill that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with a sorrow so profound it had frozen a soul. He flew for days, the world a map of greens and blues below, but he found no peace in the silent expanse of the sky. The weight of his prize grew with every league he traveled. It was not a physical weight, but a heaviness that settled in his spirit, a constant, silent reminder of the woman in the cave, of the tear on her cheek and the shield's reflection. His journey was interrupted by a scream, not of a monster, but of a mortal. Looking down, he saw a coastline ravaged by chaos. A great beast of the sea, Cetus, was rising from the depths, its massive form a nightmare of scales and teeth, summoned to punish a queen's vanity. Chained to a rock at the edge of the water was a sacrifice, the Princess Andromeda, her white robes a stark contrast to the dark stone and the churning, angry waves. The hero in Perseus, the part of him that had vowed to protect his mother, could not ignore the sight. He descended. The soldiers on the shore were useless, their spears shattering against the monster's hide. Without a second thought, Perseus reached for his terrible weapon. He held the bundled head high, and averting his own eyes, pulled away the cloth. He did not look at the beast. He looked at its shadow on the water. He watched as the shadow froze, as the churning sea around it grew still. When he dared to look, the monster was no longer moving. It was a grotesque statue of sea stone and rage, its jaws open in a silent, eternal roar. The people on the shore cheered. They called him a savior, a demigod. But Perseus felt no triumph. He quickly covered the head again, his hands shaking. He had not won a battle, he had merely passed on a curse. The power he wielded was absolute, but it was ugly. It was the power of a woman's stolen life, her final defense now a tool in the hands of her killer. As he freed Andromeda from her chains, he understood. This head was not a trophy. It was not a symbol of glory or a testament to his strength. It was a burden, an artifact of profound tragedy, a weight he would have to carry all the way home, its cold seeping deeper into him with every life it ended. After dealing with the tyrant King Polydectes and saving his mother, Perseus knew his journey was not truly over. There was one final debt to pay, one final burden to deliver. He did not keep the head as a trophy of his own glory. It did not belong to him. He ascended the Acropolis, walking the same marble steps Medusa had once walked as a hopeful girl. The sun was bright, but the air around him was cold. He carried the sack containing the head with a solemn reverence, as if bringing a sacred offering back to its temple. He found Athena standing by the great olive tree that was her symbol, her gray eyes as sharp and unreadable as ever. She did not look surprised to see him. There was no warmth in her gaze, no praise for his victory, only a quiet, knowing intensity. She had seen his entire journey from Olympus, had guided his hand, had watched as her terrible strategy unfolded. Perseus knelt. He did not speak of his travels, of Andromeda, or of the sea monster. The words were unnecessary. He simply held out the sack. "It is done," was all he said, his voice quiet. Athena reached out and took the bundle. Her fingers, long and graceful, were also the hands of a warrior and a master strategist. She did not flinch from the cold that seeped through the cloth. She held it for a long moment, the silence between the goddess and the demigod stretching thin and heavy. Then, with deliberate care, she unwrapped it. The face of Medusa was peaceful in death, the snakes of her hair now still and lifeless. The terror was gone, leaving only a profound, sculpted sorrow. Athena gazed upon the face of her former priestess, and for a fleeting instant something flickered in her eyes. Not guilt, not regret, but the cold acknowledgement of a terrible price paid. She turned and lifted her great shield, the Aegis, its surface shimmering with divine power. With a single, fluid motion, She pressed Medusa's face to the center of the shield. There was a flash of blinding silver light, and a sound like the hiss of 1,000 snakes turning to bronze. The head fused with the shield, becoming one with it. It was no longer a face, but an icon, a symbol of terrifying, protective power. The curse had found its final home. Medusa's gaze, the weapon born of her suffering, was now Athena's own. The goddess lifted the shield, now complete, its central image, a permanent, silent warning to all who would dare challenge her. Perseus felt the weight lift from his soul, but there was no relief in it. The burden was not gone. It had simply been passed back to the one who created it. The gods rarely confronted one another directly. Their battles were fought through mortal champions, through shifting alliances and subtle curses. But this was different. This was a debt that required a direct collection. Athena did not seek Poseidon in his golden halls beneath the waves, nor did she challenge him on Olympus, where Zeus could interfere. She found him where his power was most raw, on a storm-racked coast where jagged black rocks met a furious, thrashing sea. He stood on the shore, the lord of the ocean, trident in hand, the very air crackling with his untamed energy. He was arrogance made divine, a being of impulse and power who had never been forced to answer for his actions. He saw her approach, and a cruel, knowing smirk touched his lips. He expected a challenge of spears, a battle for territory, a familiar game of godly rivalry. He was wrong. Athena walked not as a warrior, but as a judge. Her spear was at her back, but the aegis was on her arm, its terrible centerpiece still covered. Her face was a mask of cold, unyielding calm. She stopped before him, the wind whipping her robes, the spray of the sea refusing to touch her. "Brother," she said, her voice not loud, but cutting through the roar of the surf like sharpened flint, "you have taken something from my temple." Poseidon laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "Many things are taken in this world. The strong take from the weak. It is the way of things. It is our way." Athena's eyes narrowed. "You are mistaken. You did not take. You desecrated. You did not prove your strength. You proved your cowardice, staining my sacred floors because a mortal girl denied you." His smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of divine rage. His trident hummed with power. "Watch your words, niece. You tread in my domain." For the first time, Athena lifted her shield. She did not raise it in defense. She simply uncovered the face in its center. Poseidon's eyes fell upon the bronze visage of Medusa, her serpent hair frozen in a silent hiss, her eyes wide with an eternity of sorrow and power. He flinched. He actually took a step back. It was not the petrifying gaze that moved him, but the perfect, undeniable memory of his crime, now bound forever to his rival's power. "There will be no battle today," Athena stated, her voice a final, unbreakable decree. "I have not come for war. I have come to deliver a prophecy. This face, the face of the girl you wronged, will become a symbol. Mortals, especially women, will carve it above their doors. They will wear it on their shields. It will be their guardian, a sign to ward off evil, a protector of the home. Her name will be spoken with reverence, a whisper of defiance against men like you." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "And you? Your act will be remembered for what it was. Not a conquest, a defilement, a footnote of shame in the story of a girl whose legacy you accidentally made eternal. You will rule the seas, but you will never wash this stain from your name." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing amidst the roar of his own powerless ocean, the terrible truth of her words crashing down upon him harder than any wave. Athena's prophecy was not a command, but a seed planted in the fertile ground of mortal fear and hope. The story of Perseus spread through the Hellenic world, carried by sailors and soldiers, sung by bards in firelit halls. At first it was a simple tale of heroism, of a brave demigod slaying a hideous monster. Men celebrated the victory, the triumph of order over chaos. But as the story was told and retold, its focus began to shift. It was the women who heard it differently. They listened past the boasts of the hero and heard the story of the priestess in the temple, the girl whose beauty drew the unwanted gaze of a god. They heard of a power so absolute it could stop any man in his tracks, a defense so perfect it could turn aggressors to stone. They did not hear the story of a monster. They heard the story of a survivor. It began quietly, not in a king's court, but in a dusty village on the coast of Attica. A potter's wife, whose husband's temper was as sharp as the shards he discarded, took a piece of wet clay one evening. As her husband slept, she etched a face into the small disk. It was not a beautiful face. It was a mask of fury, with wide, staring eyes and wild, coiling hair that seemed to writhe even in the clay. The next morning, she hung it over the lintel of their small home. When her husband came home drunk and angry, his eyes fell upon it. He stopped, his rage faltering for just a moment, a flicker of unease in his eyes. He did not strike her that night. The idea spread like a secret whispered from one woman to another. A weaver in Corinth, tired of the leering merchants in the agora, wove the image into the corner of a tapestry. A mother in Thebes, praying for her son's safety in a coming battle, painted the face on the inside of his shield, a secret guardian only he would know was there. Soon, the image was everywhere. It appeared on the prows of ships to ward off storms, on the kilns of potters to protect their work from cracking, on the amulets worn by children to guard against sickness and the evil eye. Soldiers, seeing its power to instill a primal fear, began to emblazon it on the bronze faces of their shields. They no longer called it Medusa's head. It was simply the Gorgonian, the face of the Gorgon. It had shed its history and become something else entirely. It was no longer the mark of a monster to be hunted, but a symbol of terrifying protection, a borrowed power for those who had none. Medusa's curse had been transformed by the very people it was meant to terrify. Her lonely, defensive gaze had become the watchful, protective shield for 1,000 homes, a silent, unblinking guardian born not from the will of a goddess, but from the shared, unspoken needs of mortals. Perseus lived the life of a hero. He became a king, married his love, Andromeda, and his name was synonymous with courage and divine favor. He was the golden son of Zeus, the man who had faced the impossible and returned with a monster's head. Bards sang his praises from Sparta to Athens, crafting epic poems of his daring. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the kingdom slept and the fires burned low, Perseus found no comfort in their songs. He would walk the palace battlements and stare into the endless, dark tapestry of the sky, and he would not see his triumphs. He would see a garden of stone figures, men frozen in their final moments of arrogance. He would hear the shriek of two immortal sisters losing the only family they had left, and he would see a face in a mirrored shield, eyes not filled with monstrosity but with a sudden, terrible understanding. He never spoke of it. To the world, the slaying of the Gorgon was his greatest victory. To him it was a wound that never healed, a silent shame he carried beneath the weight of his glory. He knew the story of the priestess, the truth that the songs conveniently forgot. He knew he had been a tool, a weapon, in a game played by gods, and that his blade had ended a life already shattered by divine cruelty. As the years passed and his hair turned to silver, the gods decided to honor him. It was their way. The greatest of heroes were given a place among the stars, their stories etched in light for all eternity. Zeus wished to immortalize his son, a shining beacon of his power and lineage. Perseus accepted the honor, but his heart was heavy. He did not want his legacy to be a lie. Standing before the Council of Olympus, he made a request that silenced the gods. He asked not for a grand constellation depicting his victory, but for two, one for himself, holding his sword and shield, a hero as the world saw him. But he pointed to a faint cluster of stars nearby, a spray of dim light often overlooked beside the brighter figures of the heavens. He asked that this be given a name as well, not the Gorgon, not the monster, but Medusa. He asked that she be placed in the sky beside him, not as his defeated foe, but as a constant companion, a silent, watchful presence. It was not a tribute to his strength, but an apology for his deed. A quiet admission, written in starlight, that his greatest legend was also his deepest regret. Athena, ever silent, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and so it was done. When mortals looked up at the night sky, they saw the mighty constellation of Perseus. But those who knew where to look, those who listened to the whispers behind the myths, could find the fainter stars nearby. A scattered memory of a priestess, placed forever next to the hero who was forced to kill her. A silent apology shining down through the ages. Centuries passed, as they do for gods, like sand shifting in a slow, silent hourglass. On the high peak of Olympus, Poseidon still ruled the seas, and Zeus still hurled thunderbolts. The world of men fought its wars, built its empires, and told its stories. And in the heart of Athens, the Parthenon stood, a monument of white marble and unwavering strength, the eternal home of Athena. The goddess sat alone on her throne, the great hall empty save for the moonlight that streamed through the high columns, painting the floor in shades of silver and gray. The air was still, heavy with the weight of ages and the silence of divinity. In her lap rested the aegis, its polished surface gleaming. Her fingers, long and pale, did not trace the patterns of battle or victory. They rested gently on the bronze face at its center, the Gorgon, Medusa. The features were no longer a trophy of a hero's quest or a weapon of terrifying power. In the quiet solitude of her temple, it was just a face, a silent, eternal reminder. Athena had won. Her temple was cleansed. Her rival was shamed. Her power was absolute. These were the calculations of a goddess, the cold arithmetic of wisdom and strategy, and for a long time it had been enough. But now, she saw it differently. She, the patron of weavers, the one who understood how every thread contributed to the final design, could finally see the whole tapestry. She saw a thread of devotion, a young girl's hands flying across a loom. She saw a thread of fear, a prayer whispered in a sacred hall. She saw a thread of pride her own, a cold and rigid thing that refused to bend. And she saw the thread of her fury, a dark, venomous strand she had used not to mend the pattern, but to tear it apart, reweaving it into a shape of monstrous grief. She had intended to protect her own honor, but in doing so she had chained Medusa's legacy to her own. The face on her shield was no longer just Medusa's, it was Athena's. It was the face of her own mercilessness, her own failure of compassion. Every time a woman hung the Gorgonion above her door for protection, she was unknowingly praying to the memory of Medusa's pain and invoking the shadow of Athena's regret. The goddess of wisdom had finally learned the one lesson that could not be taught through battle or strategy. She learned that true wisdom was not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to bear their weight. The face on her shield would never speak, but its silence was the most profound lecture she would ever receive. It was a story of a weaver, a priestess, and a goddess, and it was a reminder, eternal and unchanging, that the most powerful weapon in any world is not a sword, nor a spear, nor even a gaze that turns men to stone, but the compassion that is so often and so tragically forgotten.